Hey, good morning to everybody watching this on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn. Maybe you're watching this on replay on Rumble, or you're listening to this on the audio podcast of the Success is a Choice podcast network. I'm Jamy Bechler. I'm one of your co-hosts of the Talent and Strategy Show here today. This show is made possible by our friends over at Affinity Recruiting and Consulting. You can check out all the things that they do at affinitytoday.com. Before we get to our guests, our thought for the day: are the things we are doing today getting us closer to our future goals? Are the things we are doing today getting us closer to our future goals? Today, we're going to talk about mindset, having a winning mindset. And so that's a good idea or a good thought to get into our heads as we start this. Let me bring in our co-host. If you're new to the show, it's Ruston Pierce. Ruston is the president of consulting for Affinity Recruiting and Consulting. He's also a former college and high school coach, a former superintendent, administrator, school headmaster, grand poobah. He's the man. Ruston, how you doing today?
Great. How are you?
Man, I'm doing awesome. Doing awesome. Appreciate you joining us again this morning. But
every time you do that intro, I get more titles. I have no idea what I do anymore.
Next year, we're gonna, yeah. It's going to be tough. I'm going to keep making up titles or something, but you've done a lot. You've done a lot, been a lot of places. So you bring a lot of experience and knowledge to the show. So we appreciate you coming back week after week. But the real star of the show, we're going to bring her in, Vera Jo Bustos. She is a mental performance expert, all things mindset related. She is the author of, if you can see this, Mindful Journey. That's her book, A Mindful Journey. She's also a former former college athlete, professional basketball player as well. So Vera Jo, welcome to the show.
Always a pleasure. And Jamy and Ruston, I have to say, between the two of you, is there anything you haven't done? Athletic
director. I'm saving that for retirement.
Okay, I like it.
I was an athletic director, and it wasn't. I grew tired of people complaining, hey, there's not blue Gatorade in the concession stand. You ran out of blue Gatorade. All you have left is red Gatorade. You get tired of that a little bit. But yeah, I was an athletic director, but Ruston was a headmaster and a superintendent and a school administrator. So he's done a lot of things. Well, we wanted to bring you on to talk about mindset. And we have a lot of coaches, a lot of educators, a lot of leaders that watch this, but we also have a lot of people in the corporate space, the business space as well. And really, when you're talking about an organization, a business, a team at that level, or a sports team, a lot of times the same things that go into having a winning mindset in achieving goals or achieving success are oftentimes the same. Just some of those strategies you can tweak a little bit, or some of the dynamics are a little bit different. But we want to have Vera Jo on. I gave kind of a really brief synopsis of who you are, but give us kind of a 30,000 foot view of what you've done in your career and what you're doing now.
Yeah, well, once you get past the athletic stage and being a college athlete and a professional athlete, which I think gives a lot of great context on how to not only lead yourself, but how to lead others when it comes to communication, especially, but also just the discipline that goes in within that as well. But so now I think you already hit the nail on the head. I'm a mental performance coach. That's kind of one side of my business. And then the other side, I'm represented by a speaking agency. And so I work with, on the mental performance side, one-on-one with college athletes, pro athletes, a couple mature high school athletes. Sometimes I'll partner with businesses, although that's not all that common. I would say most of the time I work with athletes, whether that's sport athletes or corporate athletes, I would like to call them. And then on the speaking side, my speaking agency places me with colleges, high schools throughout the entire nation. So between the two, that's a big full-time job right there.
Well, what do you see as, when we talk about mindset? You're a mental performance coach, a mental performance expert. When you hear the word mindset, or we hear the word mindset, oftentimes we just think maybe mental toughness or just being positive, which are not bad things necessarily, but there's obviously a little bit more to it than that. What is a mental performance coach? What is, when I say, you're an expert at mindset, winning mindsets, what does that even mean?
Well, I would use the term expert loosely. I don't consider myself an expert because there is always room for me to grow and learn as well. And so I wouldn't consider myself an expert. I would say that I'm a coach. And so part of what I do is just helping you as the athlete, as the client, essentially figure out how you could increase your performance and more commonly what's holding you back. And so most of the time, whether I'm working with a business athlete or a professional athlete, I always tend to start with confidence. Because when it comes to confidence, most of the time that confidence, whether that's imposter syndrome, I kind of somewhat boil that into confidence in itself as well. But we're most of the time holding ourselves back with that lack of confidence. And I would say that I typically teach there are 6 sources of confidence, 3 outer sources and 3 inner sources. And most of the time, those inner sources we inherently know. If I were to give you what they are, you would probably be like, oh yeah, duh, I know that. But it's those 3 outer sources that most of the time when I have my one-on-one sessions with my clients, and this is across the board, whether it's a professional athlete, whether it's a surgeon that I'm working with, whether it's a UFC fighter, whether it's a CEO of a company, those 3 outer sources are the aha moments. Those are the sources that we tend to build our foundation of confidence on without even realizing it. And those outer sources tend to hold us back more than we would hope those inner sources propel us forward.
So can you unpack those? What are
waiting. Here we go.
What are the 3 outer sources?
We got to get some anticipation, right? Got to create that intrigue. Absolutely. So let's start off with the 3 outer sources. Okay. So the first source of outer confidence, and if I were just to ask, and this is a typical question, I ask whether I'm working with an individual athlete or working with a college team, essentially. And across the board, when I were to ask, where do you find your confidence from? Majority of the time, these athletes will answer another person, a coach, a teammate, a parent, a sibling, somebody in their life helps them find that confidence, right? So that first source of outer confidence comes down to validation. It's validation. And as human beings, we want and crave that validation. But what happens when we don't get that validation? Or worse, what happens if you get the opposite of validation? What happens if you play for a coach who's demeaning or demoralizing, right? Your confidence doesn't stand a chance. And so oftentimes we tend to build up our foundation on that validation in itself. And when we don't get it, or when we get the opposite of it, that's when we crumble. The second source of outer confidence comes down to the comparison game, right? The comparison trap. And it's one of those things where whether you're a high-performing athlete, CEO, whatever it is, I call it an achiever's mindset. It's not anything you'll find on Google. I create a lot of terms on my own. So this achiever's mindset, if you will, we're used to achieving, we're used to succeeding, we're used to excelling, we're used to being the best in some shape or form. And so when we have that achievers and that competitive mindset, it's only natural for us to walk into a room, to walk into a gym, to walk onto the pitch and immediately start comparing ourselves to everybody else around us. That works for us in a lot of ways, but most of the time that comparison trap tends to work against us. And so we need to be aware of that as well. And the third source of outer confidence comes down to recent success. And so in the sports world, we'll use basketball for an example. If you've ever heard of a shooting slump, all that shooting slump is that you don't have any recent success to base that confidence on. And without that recent success, if you base your confidence on that, you're not going to have it and your foundation is going to crumble. And so when you look at those 3, and if you were to actually reflect on those 3 and spend time considering, where do I build my foundation of confidence on? Is it on 1, 2, or all 3 that my confidence is dependent on those? It's no wonder that your confidence ebbs and flows instead of being consistent.
Well, Charles Barkley, the great Hall of Fame basketball player, I heard him say once that, if he makes 7 shots in a row, he's going to take the next 7 shots because he's feeling it. Consequently, if he misses 7 shots in a row, he's still going to take the next 7 because he's a 50% shooter. So he's bound to make those next 7.
Exactly.
So I'm going to say that is one of those inner and one of those is outer. One of those is one of them where he's missing. That's an inner belief? You haven't gotten to that yet, but is that an inner confidence that you can do it, and the outer confidence is seeing that, all right, I've made 7 in a row. I know I can make the next 7.
Essentially, I would say so. So for this first source, and I typically, the inner sources, I like to share stories, but for the sake of time, I won't share those stories. We'll save those for my keynotes for you guys to bring me in, listeners, and actually hear these awesome stories that really relay and make things sticky, right? So the first source of inner confidence, this is probably one that has been rampant on social media. And once I say it, it's going to be like that. Yeah, duh, I should have known that. And that comes down to practice and preparation, right? The first source of inner confidence is practice and preparation. There is no substitute for good old-fashioned hard work. And here's another thing that when it comes to confidence is that confidence is relative. Confidence is relative. Just because I'm very confident in my abilities as a basketball player doesn't mean that I'm going to have that same confidence in my abilities as a tennis player, because I've never practiced tennis. I've never done anything to prepare, perfect my craft with that. Confidence is relative. And once you understand that, obviously the more practice preparation you put into your craft, that's where you find your confidence. So essentially, I think that's what Charles Barkley, like you say, is saying. I've prepared enough. I've practiced enough. I know my numbers enough to know that if I miss 7, the next 7 are bound to be in, because I find that belief based on the preparation. Kobe, MJ, Steph, Diana Taurasi, Candace Parker, all of these athletes, if you were to ask CEOs, surgeons, whatever it is, it all comes back to that, right? So that's the first source. And it's one of those where we're all nodding like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But this second source, I believe to be the most important source. And I had to learn that the hard way. And for this one, I think I actually will share the story where I actually unpacked that in real time. So when I was playing my professional basketball in Greece, it was my first day there, and immediately walking into the gym, I was just overwhelmed by nobody speaking English, right? And so you walk into a gym and you just imagine just foreign language, not understanding anything. And you already know, I'm assuming, I think you just had Betsy Butterick on not too long ago. Listen to that conversation, was absolutely amazing, phenomenal. So we understand the importance of communication. And when you don't understand what anybody around you is saying, already your anxiety tends to shoot up, right? And so I'm not too sure if you, or as a listener, know what it's like to play professionally overseas. But typically in the European game, you have about 10 days to prove yourself. Are you worth our time, money, and resources, right? And if you don't have what it takes, it's such a cutthroat league. They cut you, send you home, and it's next American up. Right? And so going in after my first day, I go in, lose all my luggage. Luggage isn't there. I also learned the hard way, never pack your chargers in the bag that you check, because when that gets lost, like it did, you have no way to charge your phone, your computer, to communicate with anybody back home. So I wake up the next day, unsure of what the heck I'm doing there. And I go to my first practice. And in the corner of the gym, I noticed 3 very important people that are there to watch me practice. They want to know, who is this American? And is she worth our time, money, and resources, right? I know they're there to watch me practice. So I start off with a basic layup drill, just a basic layup drill, right? At that point in time, you talk about practice and preparation. I've taken over 1 million layups in my career up in that point in time, I would assume. And so it's just a simple drill. I pass it to a teammate. She passes it back. I go up to lay it in. On the right-hand side, I'm a right-hand shooter, no defense, nothing. And I miss my first layup. You know the feeling when like your cheeks get super red and your ears are burning because you're so embarrassed. And it's the Southwest commercial. It's like, want to get away. And you're trying to find a rock to hide under. You get so embarrassed. That's how I felt after missing my first layup as a pro athlete. Like, I'm a professional athlete. I should be able to make a stinking layup. So I get in line a second time, pass, catch, and I miss it again. At that point in time, the embarrassment transfers to frustration. And then I go up a third time. I wish I could say I made it. But I not only miss, the ball hits the bottom of the rim and I have to duck so it doesn't hit me in the head. And I know the only reason why you guys are laughing is because that's happened to you as well. Don't lie. That is the only reason I get laughter in that. Otherwise, you're probably just laughing at somebody's pain, which I tend to do as well. So anyway, after this third time, that embarrassment, frustration turned into full-fledged words of poison, as I had come to call it. I'm a joke. I don't belong here. Who was I thinking? They're going to cut me and send me back home. Everybody back home is going to say, you thought you could play professional basketball? Really? You? Look at you. You don't have what it takes. You're not fast enough. You're not strong enough. The works. I don't belong here. I am a freaking joke. Mind you, all of this happened within the first 5 minutes of my first professional practice. And that's when I realized the most important source of confidence comes down to our mindset and our self-talk. It comes down to our mindset and our self-talk. And I'm not necessarily a believer in positive thinking, because if it was that easy to just think positively all the time, there would be no anxiety. There would be no performance anxiety. There would be no any of these things that we deal with, right? It's not that easy to just think positively. If it were, we would all do it. And so it comes down to our mindset and our self-talk. And I realized that because my self-talk and my mindset sucked, so did I. So did I. That's essentially what it came down to. And so that is when I realized, as a professional athlete, I also got my degree in sports psychology, my master's in human performance. So I went that route especially. But that's when I really decided to spend a lot more time studying the psychology of sport, the psychology of the way we think. And if I suffered through that, even with a degree in sports psych, how many others are suffering through that as well? And what can I do to help?
So what's our third inside source?
So the third source, sometimes in life, if you think about it, and again, I learned this from experience. Okay. So my first keynote that I ever gave was in front of a crowd of 500 plus. I was the opening keynote. The closing keynote was Rudy Rudiger. You know, Rudy Rudiger from the movie Rudy, right? They made a movie about this guy. Walk on, played at Notre Dame. He is the closing keynote. So already you talk about imposter syndrome from Brene Brown or whatever it is. I'm feeling all of these things. I practiced and I prepared. I spent my due diligence. I knew my stuff. I did that. I knew about the importance of mindset and self-talk. So I was speaking to myself with words of power instead of words of poison. But there are going to be times in life that even though you do everything in your power to knock out those two sources of inner confidence first, there are still going to be times that you still don't feel confident in yourself. In those moments, I say you just have to have 20 seconds of insane courage. Just 20 seconds of insane courage. How much more would you be? How much more would you achieve if you actually went after those things that scared you? You actually went after those moments that you thought were too big, that you didn't belong. How much more could you accomplish if you were just courageous enough to give it a try? And another thing I typically say is make somebody else tell you no. Make somebody else tell you no. A lot of times when we lack that confidence or we have that imposter syndrome, we tell ourselves no before we even give ourselves the chance to try. And so if you make somebody else tell you no, yeah, you might get a no, but now you know what you can do differently next time. Now you might be a little bit more on track to get a yes the next time you do try. I believe truly that the only failure in life is simply not trying. That's the only time we fail, is when we don't try.
I had something very similar happen once. I got asked to come speak somewhere, and I got there not really knowing anything at all about who else was going to be there. And it was on the day I was speaking, there were 3 people in a row, and I was sandwiched in the middle. And the person who spoke first had just had a book on the national bestseller list. The person who was right after me had just hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list like 3 days before. And I'm sitting there going, #1, how in the world did I end up on this list? #2, why am I with these 2 individuals? what, how do I get to speak here? And, those same thoughts were all going through my head. It was like, what on earth am I doing here? Why am I on this list? Why are they letting me talk in between these 2 people? Like, they need to just take my slot, split it in half, and let them go longer. It's amazing how our minds will absolutely tell us exactly, or we can tell our minds exactly how, all the reasons why we're not going to be successful. and how quickly we can jump to that.
Hmm. And when you unpack that a little bit further, right? So you and in yourself, that second source of confidence essentially failed you when it came down to your self-talk and your mindset,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And then when it comes to a performance standpoint from performance psychology, I like to say you have to think of T or C, threat or challenge. And so you perceive this, I would assume, if you were anything like me, your perception was this was like a threat state. And when you perceive that threat state, your ability to perform isn't anywhere near if you perceive that as a challenge state. If you see this
Sure.
as a challenge, right? And this is where we get that competitiveness. If I view this as a challenge, I'm more likely to respond. If I view this as a threat, I'm more likely to retreat.
Absolutely.
So what can a person do if they're not as good with this stuff? I'm going down this checklist. Okay, I hear these 3 outer parts to confidence, these 3 inner, and I'm not as good. What's the best route to improve these areas in my life, let's say?
Yep. I like to start with always identifying what those words of poison, I call them gremlins as well. And those gremlins, I call them sneaky little shits. Okay. Because those gremlins, when you try to identify what they are, what those negative statements you essentially tell yourself, basically it's the opposite of an affirmation, right? Those negative things, those gremlins that come up, if you just try to reflect on it right here, right now, it would probably be really hard for you to come up with them. They're sneaky little shits. But you take their power away and you get your power back when you identify what they are. And so I like to use in my teachings, I'll share a video, whether I'm working with a one-on-one client or a keynote presentation. And you've probably seen it roaming around social media for a while. I've been using this for 4 years already. But it's a video of a guy who's blindfolded and he has his hand in a glass cage and he doesn't know what's in there. It's a stuffed teddy bear, right? And his reaction to that is hilarious because we can see what it is. But what makes us laugh is because we can see that this thing cannot harm him in any way. And his reaction to that is what makes us laugh. He reacts, he doesn't respond. And so in order to change your reaction into a response, you first have to take off the blindfold and see it what it is, see it for what it is. And the only way to do that is to identify what your gremlins are. And so that's always the first step that I have. I work with, a surgeon. I work with a UFC athlete. And this UFC fighter that I worked with, this is one of the things that we spent a lot of time unpacking and uncovering is just what are your gremlins? What are those words of poison? Because the moment that you identify what those are, when they come up in our mind, which it's inevitable that it's going to happen, then it's almost like it's sounding an alarm. And that should just be like gremlin, gremlin, gremlin. Then you know that's not the truth. That's a learned lie. And sometimes those lies are internal, but oftentimes those lies come from an external source. And we just have to be able to identify when we have that thought.
You mentioned a couple of times the phrase imposter syndrome, and I know what that means, but I bet a lot of our watchers don't. Can you unpack what imposter syndrome is and how that plays into the different areas of confidence that you've already brought up?
Well, before I give my definition, Ruston, I would love to hear yours.
Well, I've worked in schools for a long time, so I've seen people who pretend to be one thing in one place, but are something very different somewhere else. I've seen students who have dual personalities where I'm one person in front of you, but a completely different person online. I've seen people who, pretend to be something they aren't to fit a niche or a need. So I've seen a lot of different versions of it. So I guess that answers as far as my knowledge of it.
Okay. Jamy, I'm curious as to what yours is.
Yeah, I would say it's when you don't think you belong, like not necessarily even you're being fake, but you don't feel like it's almost, I look at it very similar to the comparison thing. Your comparison is you're leading, like when you talked about you were on that stage with Rudy or Ruston, you were on that stage with 2 other authors, you're comparing, you're not living up, but maybe you're trying to act like you live up to that. So you're trying to fake it until you make it almost. So that would be my thought. But I'm certainly not the I know you don't like to be called the expert, but I'm certainly not as advanced in the mental training as you are, Vera.
Well, I would say imposter syndrome has a lot of different forms, and I think you are both correct in those forms. And I think it starts with where you alluded to, Jamie, where I feel as if I'm an imposter, like I don't belong. And because of that, I have to act accordingly so others can see me in a certain light, right? When it comes to that comparison game, I feel like I need to live up. And sometimes that's one way we go is I feel like I have to live up and I have to fake it till I make it essentially. But people can kind of see through that BS a little bit, right? And people can kind of see through like, okay, you're not genuine, all that kind of thing. So that's one way we can go. A different way we tend to go when that imposter syndrome happens is we simply don't try. We retreat. We see this as a threat, and I don't even ask for the raise if I feel like that's something that I should have, or playing time, or I don't even accept the keynote presentation because, hey, I don't feel like I belong on this stage. So we go one of two ways. And so when it comes to that imposter syndrome, part of that too is going back to your inner sources of confidence. Did you feel like you practiced and prepared to belong in that space? And at the end of the day, I think we have to sometimes have a better understanding of the way we determine success or define success, I would say. Because if you're only defining success from society's scorecard, essentially, which is only your achievements, your past success, right? We go back to that recent success, that third source of outer confidence. If you're only basing it on that, then you will never live up to those other people you're comparing yourself to, right? If I compared myself to you two, there would be so many other things that you two are so much more, I don't know, just experienced with, better at than I am. And so if I did that, my confidence was going to drop because I'm comparing my AOI, which this is another thing. I don't call it a weakness ever. It's an AOI. It's an area of improvement. We have to be very specific with the language we use with ourselves and our clients as well.
Sure.
So if this is an AOI that I see, like, then I'm comparing my AOI to your signature strength. That's never going to add up. I'm always going to lose when it comes to that comparison game.
Okay, so you're a coach, or you were a coach. We were all coaches. We have players that maybe aren't confident in something, whether it's shooting, whatever it is, they're not confident. What do we need to do to help them, whether it's a coach with a player or maybe it's a C-suite executive, it's a manager, it's a supervisor, a CEO, and maybe they have a team member or an employee that's not feeling confident about something. What should we be doing to instill or to help them be more confident?
Well, first off, I would say before we even get to that point in time, we have to be transformational leaders instead of transactional leaders, right? And so if I'm trying to instill confidence in an athlete or somebody that I'm leading, if I'm just leading from a place of transaction, I will never get through to that person, right? And transaction means that I only value you based on your accomplishments, right? If that's the way that I am as a leader, whether I'm a coach or a CEO, we're just not going to have the culture that we're trying to achieve. But instead, if I take on more of a transformational leader role, then I can find and meet that athlete where they are. And so that's where I would say that it starts, is you have to know where this athlete is, and you have to be able to identify and have these conversations behind the scenes with maybe what is wrong with this athlete. And I shouldn't say wrong, what is holding this athlete back? And that's the hard part, right? Because in a lot of times, if you think of football coaches, I mean, how many athletes do they have on their team? But then that's when we try to kind of divide and conquer with our assistant coaches. We should all be having these side conversations to know what's going on in our athletes' lives. And a lot of times it might be something where, and this is a Simon Sinek thing, right? If I walk into somebody's office who their numbers have been down for 6 months straight, and I walk into their office and I just tell them hey, listen, your numbers have been down for 6 months straight. If something doesn't change within the next 2 months, I don't think you're going to be here any longer. Like, how does that inspire any kind of confidence or motivation moving forward? Right. And we all know the flip side. If we go after that in a transformational way, like your numbers have been down for 6 months straight. Are you okay? Just opening up that dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's where we need to start, I believe, too. And then from there, it's really understanding these sources of confidence. Are you putting in the practice and preparation? Right? Are you practicing? Are you doing everything in your power to be prepared and ready for when I call on you on game day, or when I call on you to have this presentation? And then it's another thing that the AOIs, I like to make a list. So we have our AOIs, we have our strengths, and then we have our signature strengths. And in a lot of ways too, our AOIs, we tend to not fully understand what those are. And what I do with some of the teams that I work with is I have the athletes write that out, your AOI strength and signature strength, and the coach write that out. Because sometimes in what we see and what our coaches see are two very different things, and we need to be on the same page. And then from there, we have outcome goals and we have process goals. I'm not so sure if you all are familiar with that. So a lot of times we tend to have an outcome that we want, right? Let's just say that sports, we want to win a conference championship. Everybody has that on their goal every single year. It doesn't matter what your record was last year. Any conference you go to, every single team has that on their goal sheet, if that's something that they do. But that's sometimes an outcome that you don't always control. So instead of focusing on those outcome goals, you have to focus on the process goals. And from those processes, you can kind of make things into more actionable pieces that you can actually control, right? We go back into our circle of control and influence. Sorry, I know I'm like throwing so much at you guys. It makes sense to me. Sometimes this is one of the things that I have to work with my communication is breaking and piecing things down. That's why I have curriculum, because if I don't follow that curriculum, I'm just like spewing out too many things at once. It's like, take it slow, VJ, take it slow.
No, it's 100% correct. And I think what you just hit on is where a lot of people miss the mark, and where a lot of people really struggle in leadership is, we live in a process-driven, results-driven society. And like the Simon Sinek, example you gave, it's hard for an executive to walk in and say, you've been down for 6 months. How can we resolve this? Because that executive probably has somebody holding them accountable. Why are our numbers down for the last 6 months? Same thing with college coaches. It's a tough world because, we joke about it, but it's true. Their livelihoods are running around in the hands of 17, 18, 19-year-olds. And, you want to be transformational and you want to come alongside and grow people, but there's this behind the scenes pressure of we have to perform. And I think that's where everybody really struggles with the difference between transactional and transformational is society puts a ton of pressure on all of us to be transactional. And it's hard to separate those two things.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, and I was fortunate to play in a college culture that was very transformational, and it necessarily wasn't from the top down. It was more just all across the board, right? And we have a term, I call it, or we define this, we coined this term at Adams State University where I played my college ball. We call it carefrontation. Carefrontation. And carefrontation means that you care enough about the person you're confronting to confront the issue from a deep sense of care. Right? And so I think that's the fine line between transformational and transactional. If I'm only confronting about what I see wrong, that's very transactional. But if I can use carefrontation, now I'm coming from a place of care. Now I can better help you and assist you along the way. And if that's something that is set from the very start, so a common question that my coach would ask every single season for 4 years straight, didn't matter, incoming freshman, JUCO, whatever you were, he would always ask, would you prefer truth or harmony this season? And the upperclassmen always wanted me coming in as a freshman, always say truth. You always say truth. You never say harmony. So I didn't even want, I'm like, truth, coach, truth, right? As a freshman coming in. And it's one of those things where, truth, I was just actually having a conversation with a coach and a athlete of mine earlier, where her and her coach were having a conversation about how do you coach and motivate, and fear, using the fear tactic, a lot of times works as great motivation, right? Whether you're a CEO or a coach. But I don't like to use that fear tactic. I say you just have to be able to give a truth bomb. And again, whether that truth, like we were talking at prior to starting the recording, whether that truth is a form of flattery or whether that truth is a form of coaching, that truth is going to help us to achieve more than any kind of harmony ever will. We just have to be a little bit better at delivering those truths.
Can you have some mixture, some of both? Can it be, does it have to be an either or type thing, or can it be an and type thing?
And I think, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think of a lot of listeners or watchers of this might know Gary Vaynerchuk, Gary V.
Yep.
And he talks about kind candor, where you're telling the truth, but you're being kind while saying it. So it's not just an absolute truth bomb where you nuke the person with the absolute truth, but it's also not, just stroking their ego all the time and being, pom-pom positivity. So kind candor. Can you have both?
So what I like to use with communication, and this is a thing, I used to work for PGC basketball, Point Guard College, for many, many years. And this is an acronym I took from PGC basketball that applies to all facets, whether it's sports or business. And it's NITE communication. It's an acronym, and we spell NITE a little differently, NITE. And so with NITE communication, you start off, it's names, information, tone of voice, and eye contact. Mm-hmm. And this specifically applies to sports, because if I can get your attention first by saying your name, you're immediately going to tune in to the information I present after the fact. Versus if I give the information first and then say your name, you might miss that information because I got your attention too late.
Yeah.
Right. So names and information always come first. And that's really hard to do. If we were to try to have a names first conversation, like I would say, it would be terrible. Right? If I had to say your name prior to any question and you had to say my name prior to any answer, that's not something we're used to in our conversation. So that is practice and preparation in itself. But more importantly, it's the tone of voice and the eye contact that help with those truth bombs. So sport example, basketball, if I say, hey, Jamie, you got this. All you need to do is block him out. Versus, Jamie, you got this. All you got to do is block him out. I said the same thing. I said your name. I gave the information. But the tone of voice that I used determined the way you perceived my message that I was giving you. Right? So a lot of times it's tone of voice and then the way that we use that eye contact.
Jamie's heard that reference a lot. He was a pretty good player.
He must agree because he's silent.
No. Coach didn't yell at me much because the only reason they were mad at me was that I wasn't good enough to play instead of the people out there making mistakes.
Okay.
Yeah, I made the starters possible. Without me, you wouldn't have been able to tell. Just like I made the top 50% of my class possible academically.
Well, I'm curious, and this is something that I like to ask other high performers as well. A lot of times mental toughness is thrown around, right? That's kind of become a cliche along social media. So what is mental toughness to you guys?
So I'm married to a counselor, so my answer to that's going to be very different. Growing up, mental toughness to me was you're going to toughen up and fight through whatever. And you're not going to say how you feel about it. You're not going to say what you think. You're just going to show up and do the best you can. And whatever happens, happens. After marrying a counselor and finding out that I was going to have to communicate, which they don't tell you on the front end when you marry a counselor, I learned that I was going to have to be willing to say what I was really thinking. And that sometimes mental toughness is just being willing to state what your truth is, regardless of whether it's positive or negative. Growing up, I was taught that mental toughness was you stuff everything away and you just show up and do the best you can and don't talk about it.
Yeah, for me, it's essentially being able to have that self-talk, to not maybe immediately have the right reaction or the right response, but that you are more quickly you can bounce back, or more quickly you can transfer or have that self-talk. So maybe you react wrong initially, but then the more mentally tough you are, the more able you are then to talk to yourself and say, hey, I've got to do this differently. It's able to bounce back quicker. It's able to overcome the things that maybe come your way. And maybe you don't do it automatically, but you're able to do it much quicker than maybe you were in the past.
See, I can learn some things from you guys. That's awesome. Awesome stuff.
Now my players used to make fun of me because I would talk to them about mental toughness all the time. And two things come to mind. One is I used to tell them that growing up, like in high school, when I would get into the shower, I would put it as cold as possible because I wanted to act like a Navy SEAL and see how long I could stay in that cold water to build my mental toughness. That was a way for me to build mental toughness. And so I would talk about that, and I would talk about other things about mental toughness. And then I was coaching at a school once where we didn't have an assistant coach, and we also didn't have a trainer. So I was the person. Well, one day I dislocated my ankle in practice. And so very quickly I determined, even though it was painful, all right, we have no trainer and we have no one else to take over practice. So practice is done if I don't do something. So I went ahead and popped the ankle back in, and it was completely dislocated. I popped the ankle back in, and the young ladies scattered like they were cockroaches when the lights come on. Like they thought that was the grossest thing they'd ever seen. But I will say, for the rest of the year, when I talked about mental toughness, they were locked in because they saw me have at least one example of being mentally tough, or, maybe certifiably crazy. Maybe there's a fine line between the two.
Maybe there is a fine line. Absolutely.
They also didn't sleep for several nights because the sound of relocating a joint of that size is really loud.
It was gross. Yeah, but immediately my pain went away. It was crazy. You put that thing back in its socket and my pain went away.
I hope I never have to find that out firsthand. So I would say the definition, or the way that I define mental toughness is, and I would agree with both of you, right? And I just kind of have it in a nice little sentence here. It's the ability to choose what you focus on. It's mental toughness, right? So Jamy, you use the example of a cold shower. And that's something that I do tell my clients, like, yeah, this is a great way to build mental toughness, because immediately once that cold water starts hitting you, your immediate response is to get out, right? It's to get out of that cold water. But if you can choose where you put your focus, instead of focusing on the pain, instead of focusing on the cold, can you choose to put your mind someplace else? That's mental toughness. At the end of the game, at the end of practice, you're running wind sprints, you're in crunch time, and your muscles are burning, your lungs are burning. Are you going to choose to focus on the fatigue, on the pain, or are you going to choose to focus on what needs to be done in this moment? It's the ability to choose where we put our focus. And everything that I think both of you guys said essentially boils down to that statement. And I would agree with everything you all said about mental toughness for the most part. And I think too, there is a fine line between mental toughness and crazy, right? Because there are times, and this is another thing, as achievers like we are, the achievers mindset that we have is we're going to power through no matter what.
Yep.
And sometimes that actually works against us, right? It's a double-edged sword. This achiever's mindset is a double-edged sword, because most of us have gotten to where we are today because of that achiever's mindset. But if we continue going, that double-edged sword is essentially going to nip us in the butt. Like it's not going to happen. It's not going to work for us. So we need to figure out what that fine line is. Right? Like Jamy, yeah, you pop that ankle back into place. But if you had a broken leg, would you know that you could still practice that same day? You would not try to practice on a broken leg. Sometimes that mental toughness, yes, the ability to focus where I put my focus, choose to focus on that, but understanding that sometimes there are limitations. So I think there is definitely a fine line between the two, and we have to better understand what those limitations are, because if we don't, that's where burnout comes. And that's a big thing, I know, as well. Something that would be a whole other hour that we could talk about.
Absolutely.
How do you, if you're a high achiever, so, we've all been in athletics, we've all been coaches. We like to think of ourselves as high achievers, or we have high expectations, high standards. How do we deal with or work with people that don't have the same standards or aren't as high of achievers or haven't gotten to that point yet?
It's a great question. And honestly, that's not something that I know I have a direct answer to, but something that I would say is I call it standard over feeling. Standard over feeling, right? And this is one thing too, when we're developing our culture, is identifying what your standards are. And so if I set the standards for myself, Ruston, you set the standards for yourself, Jamy, you set the standard for yourself, that is the standard that us as a team are going to hold you accountable to, because that is your standard. And then we could also have a standard as a team. And if we all buy into that, and if we all live up to that, that's going to help us better to achieve those outcome goals based on the process that we do every single day. But if I give into those feelings, that's why it's standard over feeling, because if I give into the feelings of laziness, the feelings of procrastination, the feelings of imposter syndrome, or whatever that is, my feelings are going to win every single time if I don't discipline my mindset to overcome them. So we have to live our life by our standard over our feeling.
Absolutely.
And like I said, I'm not an expert, so I'm still learning the answer to that question as well.
I think everyone is. I think that's a really hard question that everybody struggles with, regardless of industry, regardless of where they are in the hierarchy of their company. I think that's a constant issue that everybody struggles with.
And when I'm working with coaches, one of the things that I'm trying to impart upon them, without going in the weeds too much, is that we're different than our athletes. We're going to have a different mentality. Our perspective is different. Our point of view is different. We also have longer lived experiences. We have successes and failures. We've matured or not matured, but we're at a different place in life than our athletes sometimes, whether that's, it doesn't matter what it is. I see this a lot with captains. We expect our captains to be essentially an extension of us on the field or on the court or on the pitch, but they're not an assistant coach. They're not just a younger version of us. They're a teenager or they're a young adult still trying to figure it out. Yet our expectations are pretty high on our captains. But this could go into almost anything. Our expectations or our standards, sometimes we project that onto others. I expect Ruston to be the same as me, and that's not the case. And so oftentimes we have to temper our expectations of our people or our team members, so that then when they fall short, which they're bound to do because they're not us, when they fall short, we don't just, essentially bury them. We don't essentially, kick them to the curb because they fell short of what we expected, but our expectations were probably unreasonable to begin with.
And I think when dealing with those expectations too, our form of communication with that has to be deliberate in the sense of, so for example, if I'm, communicating this expectation, and somebody falls short. And I think this is something that Betsy alluded to in your last one, right? Instead of just telling them what needs to be done, it doesn't necessarily work that way. So we have to be able to lead and coach in the form of questions, because that's going to help transform way better than just simply telling them what needs to be done or what they need to do or what I'm expecting of you. But when I can lead in the form of question and ask them how they would make this happen, what they would do differently to achieve this, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently? Now that helps them grow instead of just telling them what to do. And then they almost sort of get defensive with that as well. And then they start to feel that imposter syndrome, like they can never live up. But when you can lead and coach in the form of question, that helps with that transformational relationship.
Well, we're going to jump into our quote of the day as we wrap up our show today. It's been a great show, lots of great insights. So we'll do our quote of the day, and then we'll get our final parting thoughts from our two guests, Ruston first, and then Vera Jo. So our quote of the week comes from the legendary Hall of Fame basketball player Kobe Bryant. He says, "Every leader has critics, cynics, and haters. It goes with being a leader. Leaders take the rocks thrown and build something great with them." The main part of that I like the best is the mindset of it, of leaders take them and they take the rocks thrown and they build something with it. They don't just take it upon themselves and, go hide in a cave. They build something with it. They make the best of it, whatever that is. So guys, I would ask for parting shots, parting thoughts as we talk about mindset and wrap up our show today.
Well, I love that quote. Actually, I've never heard that one before. That's new. So I love that quote. I would say probably my biggest parting thought is I love the resources that we're able to bring to the table. The last month or so, these episodes have just been incredibly thoughtful. They've been really useful, very practical. I thought Vera gave some fantastic information, regardless of what industry you're in, practical things that people can walk away and actually use literally today. So I think that's probably my biggest parting thought is, I feel like we're really providing something that's really, really helpful. And I hope people are really taking and using the things that we're talking about.
Awesome. Well, going back to that Kobe quote, the first thing that came to my mind is the quote, criticism is the tax on success, right? Criticism is a tax on success. And just like when we actually pay taxes, the more money you make, the more tax you have to pay, the more successful you are, the more criticism you're going to endure. And I think that's great what Kobe said. And I think there's a fine line too with just having such a huge ego that any criticism that comes away, we think we're bigger, better than, and not listening to anything, versus taking some of that truth that comes from that criticism and then growing from that. And so I think the better able you are to take that criticism in the form of coaching, the more you're going to be able to grow, regardless of what stage you're in, whether you're a middle school athlete or whether you're a CEO of a top Fortune 500 company.
Well, we appreciate that. Great insights from both of you. We really appreciate your time. Ruston, you hit it right on the nose with the resources available. And for those of you listening, you can find all those resources at successisachoicepodcast.com, successisachoicepodcast.com. You can find all the old episodes of the Talent and Strategy Show, as well as many of the other episodes and shows that we do as well. We also have all of Vera Jo Bustos's links where you can contact her, where you can get her book, A Mindful Journey. So we'll have all those in the show notes as well. But we'd love to have you join us next week, same time, 11 a.m. Eastern time on every Friday. We have the Talent and Strategy Show. Guys, appreciate it. Have a great week until you join us next week for another great guest. And until next time, remember that success is a choice. What choice will you make today?